there is a lot of greenwashing going on, and we are overstepping all of those planetary boundaries. And consumers, retailers, governments are becoming a lot more discerning in this space, and they're understanding what real sustainability means.
Welcome to the Regeneration Will Be Funded. I'm your host, Matthew Monahan, and in this series, we're having conversations about regenerative finance, technology, and our living planet. How can we build an economy that's in service to life? Brought to you by Ma Earth. You can find all of our conversations at maearth.com. Thanks for joining us. Welcome. Today's conversation is with Florence Van Dyke. Florence is the co-founder of Chia Sisters, an incredible superfoods company here in New Zealand. More recently, she's also become the global sustainability lead at New Zealand Trade and Enterprise. In this discussion, I asked Florence what she's learning in this new role in government, and she describes the major changes coming from the regulatory landscape, especially as it relates to climate policy and originating from Europe, and what impact that will have on New Zealand businesses and the economy. And on a sobering note, that we are not quite ready and maybe a bit flat-footed for the years ahead. I hope you get value from this conversation. Let's dive right in with Florence Van Dyke. We are here today with Florence Van Dyke. Thank you, Florence, for doing this.
Great to be here. I'm the co-founder of Chia Sisters and the global sustainability lead at New Zealand Trade and Enterprise. And today I'll just be speaking on behalf of myself.
And so maybe we start with Chia Sisters. Can you tell us a bit about that journey?
Yeah, absolutely. So my sister and I co-founded Chia Sisters in around 2014. And right from the outset, our values were nutrition, innovation, and sustainability. So we really wanted to be living and breathing that sustainability value.
And it's been quite a ride, I imagine. I mean, the company's grown quite a bit. You're now global. Can you give us a bit more broad strokes of where the enterprise is at?
Yeah, absolutely. We started with our chia drinks, which were created because actually my dad is a world champion swimmer, and I've always been super involved in sports and triathlon, and my sister is very entrepreneurial and had done herbal medicine diploma and a university degree in neuroscience. And so my dad was using these chia seeds to help fuel his training. And my sister started looking at the nutrients in those chia seeds, lots of iron and calcium and magnesium, and realized that there might be a business opportunity in the supermarket to replace energy drinks that were filled with sugar and caffeine and artificial ingredients. So it started then. That was about 2013. And I think, right from the outset, we were quite shocked at the impact that businesses were obviously having on the environment. And we really wanted to use our business as a platform to show that business could have a positive impact on people and the planet, on our communities, while also making a profit as well.
Yeah, and you've really been a leading voice, you and your sister, in New Zealand around this kind of business for good and how do we create more sustainability mindedness in our enterprises. And I assume that's partly what drew you to this role that you took on last year at New Zealand Trade and Enterprise. Can you share more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think through Chia Sisters, I'd learned a lot about how to incorporate sustainability. Some of the things that we'd done were quite simple to start with, lining our factory with solar panels, measuring our carbon footprint, pay all our staff the living wage. And while those were really difficult, what we really saw is that actually those could have a positive impact on our business. We became more resilient. We understood our supply chain more. We have a fantastic team. And in 2019, we co-founded Businesses for Climate Action as a way to spread that word, as a way to share our lessons with other businesses. And the shift into the role at New Zealand Trade and Enterprise was an extension of that. I really see value in sharing that knowledge that I've built through Chia Sisters to support other businesses in their sustainability strategies, because I think that there's lots of opportunity to use sustainability to grow business and also to decrease risk.
Yeah, I mean, I find your background so fascinating because you have this legal training and context, and then you have this highly entrepreneurial startup business context, also in kind of the realm of more sustainable business and social enterprise. And then now you have this government lens and perspective, and it's a pretty rare combination. I'm curious how that feels for you to kind of be sitting in multiple worlds and to have those different lenses into these sustainability challenges.
Yeah, absolutely. I think in some ways at the time it's felt like a lot of sidesteps, but when it's all come together, it's been really helpful, because I think a lot of people working with businesses and government don't understand what it's actually like to run a business, and that has been really helpful in my new role, and I think it helps build a lot of credibility as well. What's also been interesting more recently is as these regulations come into force around sustainability globally, which are really quite new, but coming into force so quickly, that legal background that I've had, well, it's almost a decade ago now, has really helped me to understand what they look like, how they're going to be applied to businesses, and what the future economy might be like as a result.
Yeah, I think this journey of doing these interviews for the better part of the last year, we were coming at it from more of a financial lens and regenerative finance, sustainable finance, and I've grown to appreciate how much of the policy and regulatory side of these conversations are really hand in hand with that, but also really driving. That's where a lot of the action is right now. So excited to get deeper into that. But first, maybe, especially for someone overseas, what is New Zealand Trade and Enterprise? What does it do? What is this governing body?
New Zealand Trade and Enterprise purpose is to grow New Zealand export businesses for the good of New Zealand. And so we support New Zealand exporters to do that. And we work quite closely with two ministries, the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade.
Yeah, so obviously New Zealand is a very export-driven country. So trade and enterprise plays an instrumental role in setting regulations and supporting businesses for I guess they don't set regulations, do they? Yeah.
Don't set regulations, but it's a really important point, because New Zealand relies quite heavily on our export economy because we're a small country, so we need to import a lot. And to balance that out, we need to export. And that's why there is a real focus on having an agency like New Zealand Trade and Enterprise, which is quite unique on the world stage.
And personally, how did it feel to go from startup to I'm going to take that role inside of a governmental body?
Yeah, it's a good question. So in between those two things, I spent a year studying a master's in business and climate change at UC Berkeley. And what I really enjoyed about that is it enabled me to step back from the day-to-day operations of Chia Sisters, which I love. I love the business hustle, but it's also nice to look at the big picture and realize that actually the most impact that I can have is influencing other businesses and supporting our economy to make that shift rather than the day-to-day grind of small business.
Yeah. Okay, so you're almost 18 months into this role. I'm so curious, what are you learning? What are you observing? And help paint a picture for, the landscape as you see it.
I think the most interesting thing is how quickly this landscape is changing. If you'd said 5 years ago that the standard for our exporters in most markets would be to measure their carbon emissions or understand their climate risk, people would have laughed at you. And now that's very much the norm, especially when we're talking about our exports to the UK and Europe. And another interesting thing that's happened is that during COVID, New Zealand got a name for itself on the world stage as a values-based economy. And because of that, our sustainability story was really elevated. I don't think that's necessarily a platform that we deserve, but there is an opportunity there to add more premium to our exports through sustainability if we lean into that. But we do need to be walking the talk to get that premium.
Yeah, and I want to talk more about the New Zealand side. But so what are some of those new regulatory changes happening in EU and UK, and what does it practically mean?
It's a huge alphabet soup out there, but I'll start with climate-related disclosures. They are regulations that require large companies, usually listed companies, to measure and disclose their carbon emissions and also their climate risks. And these type of regulations are in force or coming into force in the UK, in Europe, in Canada, in California, Singapore, Australia, and here in New Zealand. And what they mean is that these listed companies, they need to disclose their scope 1, 2, and 3 carbon emissions, which also means their downstream and upstream emissions, so their suppliers' emissions. So the effect of that is that any company that wants to supply a listed company in one of those countries that I just mentioned needs to understand their carbon footprint so that their customer can meet these now legal requirements. And the knock-on effect, given the interconnected nature of our economy globally, is massive. I was speaking with just to bring it to life, I was speaking with a small, or I guess medium by New Zealand standards company, Golden Bay Fruit, in my hometown of Whakatū Nelson recently. And their marketing manager, Eleni Hogg, who's also been put in charge of sustainability, which is often the way, was talking about a letter that they had received from Tesco's that week. And Tesco supermarkets, grocery chain in the UK, they have required Golden Bay Fruit, this company, to disclose their scope 1, 2, and 3 carbon emissions. They're requiring them to set a climate ambition, which wouldn't be so hard if it wasn't for the third requirement, which is that ambition reflects science-based targets. So that means it reflects the Paris Agreement commitments to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees, which usually means reducing your carbon footprint by about 40% by 2030. And so that's gross emission reduction. And the impact of this for a company like that, it's massive. They're going to have to look at renewable energy, how they can electrify their operations, ensure their staff are travelling less. And this is just one example of a smallish company in New Zealand that's having to meet these new requirements because of these climate-related disclosures.
So that company cannot supply to those listed companies in the EU unless it does these requirements.
Yeah, so in this case, Tesco, the UK supermarket chain, has set these requirements. It's actually gone slightly above and beyond the regulation, but that's not unique at all. So it's being led out by grocery chains in the UK, Aldi, Tesco, Waitrose, Sainsbury. But it also, we're seeing that, across the board in the UK and the EU. And the ultimate driver, as you say, is those regulations.
Yeah, I think it's such an important point because when we hear climate disclosures or reporting or accounting legal standards and frameworks, it almost feels like filling out your tax returns. Like it's just going to be more paperwork at the end of the day. Whereas this is actually, the way that you are incentivized to be selling in your channels, like you need to now make sure that you're positioned for the customers, for the demand.
Exactly.
And that demand not only has a clean, green marketing image, but now it actually has real teeth of you need to be setting forth the frameworks and the standards in which your carbon reductions are going to take place, not by 2050, right? But actually this decade. And so, it just feels like it brings so much to home. And I don't know that we're like, the conversation is yet everyone's digested the magnitude of these changes.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. I think understanding what it means for business and those types of examples is really important because it's not a conversation that I'm hearing a lot yet. But all of these regulations that climate-related disclosures, but also the CSRD, CBAM, these types of regulations are coming into force basically now for the reporting period over the next couple of years. And businesses that don't understand them now are going to really struggle in the next couple of years.
Right. Okay, so what is CSRD?
So that's the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, and it's similar to climate-related disclosures in that it requires listed companies to report on sustainability risks and opportunities. And it also goes much broader. I think often when we have this conversation, we are directed right to climate and everyone's talking about carbon emissions and it's easy-ish to measure. But actually, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, it applies to much broader sustainability initiatives. So modern-day slavery, deforestation, applies to nature and biodiversity. And it requires bigger businesses in Europe, I think at the moment it applies to the largest 50,000 businesses, to disclose their opportunities and risks associated with sustainability. And soon in the next couple of years, it's going to apply to smaller businesses as well. So that same thing is going to happen with those knock-on effects as the suppliers to all of those businesses globally need to share, whether they've got a modern-day slavery-free supply chain, for example, there's going to be much greater disclosure requirements. And I think transparency is really at the heart of this conversation as well. It's not good enough just to say, I'm not sure where I get that product from in my supply chain. You need to know where it comes from and be able to prove that it's ethical as well.
Right. And then you mentioned CBAM. So what is that one?
CBAM stands for Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, and it is a carbon tax for high emission imports into Europe. So that includes things like steel, concrete, hydrogen, and fertilizer. What that means is, for example, if a company in New Zealand, let's say Golden Bay Concrete, is exporting concrete to Europe, they will need to pay a tax, a carbon tax, at the border. And interestingly, that carbon tax is the difference between the carbon tax they might have to pay in New Zealand and the higher carbon tax they might need to pay in Europe. I think a great thing about Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism as a lever for change is that it will disincentivize outsourcing the production of high emission activities to countries which might not have carbon regulation, because at the end of the day, there'll still need to be a carbon tax applied when it hits that European border.
Right. So if Europe only was taxing carbon emissions, carbon production inside of its borders, then a business might have an incentive to go, let me just go outsource that to some other country with 0% tax, bring that product back, and now I have a cost advantage. But no, that doesn't work anymore, because when you do that import process back, it gets shored up back to the tax level of Europe.
That's exactly right. And the European Union have made it very clear that they'll be expanding CBAM to other goods in the near future as well. Right.
So one pushback, and I think criticism that is prevalent inside of Europe is, well, are these regulations going to disadvantage businesses in the region? Are a lot of activities, is leakage going to happen elsewhere? But I think one interesting point that you've made is actually Europe is setting the standards, and that this is actually now having knock-on effects to many other countries. Can you share more about that line of thinking and what you're seeing?
Absolutely. We're seeing what's called the Brussels effect in play, and that's when the highest standards globally, which are in Europe for sustainability regulation, are applied across a corporation's global operations. So what we're seeing is that multinationals are taking the standard from Europe and applying them elsewhere. These are companies like Danone, Nestle, McDonald's that have huge global supply chains. An example of that'll impact New Zealand businesses is McDonald's operations in China. So we export our dairy to McDonald's in China, and McDonald's has decided to take that European standard, not right now, but over the next 2 to 3 years, and apply it globally. So New Zealand dairy, for example, will need to disclose its carbon emissions, its carbon reduction plan in order to continue to be a supplier to McDonald's in China. And I think the really interesting thing about this is a lot of people are saying, oh, well, that's just Europe or that's just the UK. But these multinationals are actually taking charge and leading the way. And I think one of the reasons they're doing that is because they can see this regulation will probably come into force in other countries, but also they actually just see the benefits. We know that businesses that understand their supply chain, that understand their climate risks, are more resilient in the face of global challenges. And so it's actually beneficial for those large companies to gain that data and get that better understanding of what's happening in their supply chains.
Yeah, I mean, it's really profound to think that a law change in Europe is now already having an impact on how New Zealand dairy sources through McDonald's to China. Yeah.
A very interconnected
and it's
economy.
a less cynical view of, I guess, globalization and the way that we do this, that we're all kind of putting the trust forward that like, okay, we're going to set a higher bar and we're going to go above and beyond what's absolutely the current legal mandate. And then that's going to have a follow-on effect, and someone else picks up that baton, and someone else picks up that baton, and like this is how it spreads, and we're all in this together, and we're not going to get out of here, alone. So, any other commentary on like, are you feeling positive and optimistic of what you're seeing? I'm sure there's a lot of like moments where you're like, oh my God.
Yeah, I really oscillate on that one, but overall I am feeling positive. And I think an interesting point to what you're saying is I always used to think that it would be consumers that would drive this change.
Totally.
But actually, we're really seeing that some of these companies like Tesco, for example, these grocery chains are actually driving a higher standard, and they're doing it to add resilience to their businesses. And then having that finance lever on top of that, that investment piece, those are the two areas that I'm seeing are the greatest drivers over just consumers.
So I want to ask you about the finance piece, but one other thing you said about, this really drives transparency across supply chains. And it seems like it's going to be quite a task to instrument our supply chains with the data, the measurements, and the transparency that's really required. What are you seeing there? Do you feel like the tools are developing quickly enough? And also, like, how does it feel, given you understand, like, how hard it is to be a small business when you have so much regulation and new requirements and just trying to keep up with all of this? Do you worry that it's going to disadvantage those smaller projects and enterprises?
Those are really interesting questions. I think we need to rapidly digitalize the reporting space and that supply chain transparency space, because at the moment I don't think the tools exist, and they are developing, but a huge amount of work needs to be done. And I think open sourcing that globally is the best way to get there. We've been talking about the alphabet soup of regulation, and I don't think that helps, because there's all of these different standards and requirements, and the data that's required is different for each one. And I'm really hoping that washing machine effect will be solved in the next couple of years, and we'll have the same standards globally and the right tools to enable small businesses and all businesses to get there.
Yeah. I'll just give a quick plug and shameless promotion for a conversation we had with Alan Ransell from Filecoin Green and Protocol Labs, for people who are interested in doing like much more of a technical deep dive into some of the efforts around that digitalization of supply chains using kind of the most advanced cryptographic math geeky fun tools. So check that one out if you're interested.
I'd love to.
But yeah, also on that point about how does it downstream affect small businesses and their ability to compete?
I think that it does create some challenges for small businesses, but at the end of the day, I also think data is power, and the more we know about things like our climate risks or our nature risks, the more we know about our suppliers, the better. And that applies to big businesses and small businesses. So I actually think that these changes can help all corporates, all businesses.
Yeah, if you're wanting to supply to larger businesses that need to comply and want to have these standards and other businesses in your landscape aren't yet there, there's your go-to-market opportunity.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
Move
And
quickly.
sometimes as a small business, you have the opportunity to be much more nimble. You're probably more likely to have less suppliers. In Chia Sisters' case, we've got our apple growers and boysenberry growers down the road. We have strong relationships with them already. So in some ways, that reporting piece is actually a little bit easier.
Yeah. And you had mentioned in that Golden Bay example, the sustainability director being the same as the marketing director. And I feel like the sustainability conversation has, in many ways, lived within a marketing and comms function. And now we're maybe seeing it more in the accounting and legal function as well. But yeah, what are you witnessing in that context? Help me address the fear that this is all still just greenwashing and, trying to put on a pretty face, but actually the brass tacks of the situation is much more dire and we're not changing our practices nearly enough.
I think there's 2 points here. The first is that there is a lot of greenwashing going on and we are overstepping all of those planetary boundaries. And when you look on the global stage, the data isn't looking that good in a lot of areas. What is positive is that consumers, retailers, governments are becoming a lot more discerning in this space and they're understanding what real sustainability means. And in some markets, they're not going to take those greenwashing stories much longer. And you can see a lot of businesses getting called out for that. I think recently in the UK, Gucci got called out for having a net zero carbon product. And the UK government said, hey, offsets really don't stack up anymore. You can't call this net zero carbon unless you're reducing gross emissions. So there are a few golden lights out there of change happening. And I think that a lot of that is being driven from regulation and from consumer education. And so increasingly, I think that we will see sustainability roles popping up, not just in that comms and marketing department, but across accounting and legal, for example.
Nice. Okay. So we've talked a lot about kind of the regulations upstream in EU and UK, but obviously we're here in New Zealand and that's where a lot of your work is focused. So yeah, what do you see happening here? Obviously, you mentioned we are an export-driven economy and there's a lot of context around the supply chains and how we're supplying our goods globally. But what else are you witnessing in the landscape?
I'm definitely seeing an increase in sustainable finance and in the investment space. Simpson Grierson did a study recently that showed that of investors looking to invest in New Zealand businesses, 75% were more interested than ever before in ESG and environmental social governance of the businesses that they were investing in. And 40% said that they'd walked away from a deal because they didn't believe businesses were doing well enough in those areas. And those investors were all planning to invest in New Zealand companies in the next 5 years. So a super relevant space. And we're also seeing that trickle down to sustainable finance from banks. So increasingly, the likes of Kiwibank are offering sustainability-linked loans to companies. Chia Sisters was one that secured a sustainability-linked loan this year. And what I like about these is it's not a charity case. It's not a handout from the bank. They're doing this because sustainable businesses that understand their broader stakeholders, their supply chain, the impact on Papatūānuku, on their community, on their team, these businesses are proven to be more resilient in the face of global challenges and complexities. And so they are less risky financial investments for that bank, which justifies the lower interest rate loan.
Yeah. So help me understand the mechanics of that Chia Sisters sustainability-linked loan with Kiwibank. You walk into Kiwibank, you're like, we want a loan. So your targets are based on sustainability metrics?
That's right. They're based on reduction of carbon emissions, of reporting. For us, that's a B Corp report that we comply with. Got it.
And then that is how you get the agreed upon interest rate. And what happens if you don't meet those sustainability standards?
If we don't meet those sustainability standards, then we get bumped up to their default interest rate.
Got it. And what's the delta between those interest rates? Is it meaningful?
It does change, but it's between 1% and 2%, which at the moment, every percent makes a difference.
Sure. Yeah. So you get a bit of a discount if you meet certain sustainability requirements. And yeah, I guess it goes back to just this stack of incentives. There's some carrots and some sticks in the stack, and some legally mandated things and some voluntary and optional things, and certainly a lot of signs that in the future we'll need higher stringency and standards around climate. And so it makes sense to invest now and to get ahead of the curve. So that is an example where lending is being affected by sustainability standards. And you mentioned ESG on the investment side. Obviously, Chia Sisters has been around for some time. You were quite early before ESG was in vogue, before impact investing even necessarily was certainly within New Zealand of any magnitude. Yeah, how are you seeing the equity investment landscape maturing for some of those smaller social enterprise-oriented businesses?
We're definitely seeing more and more investors interested in social enterprises, and we've had a number of investors approach Chia Sisters partly because we're meeting those really high standards. And to go back to a point before, we're not just meeting the future regulatory standard like reporting on our carbon footprint, but we're walking the talk on things like the living wage and solar panels. We're reducing our waste through supplying in kegs on tap. So we've got that sustainability story that we know that consumers are looking for, and we'll add that premium, which is obviously a benefit for investors too.
Yeah, so it sounds like there's a theme of going beyond carbon, but also beyond environment. It's really hand in hand with the social issues as well. And can you talk a bit more about this modern day slavery in the supply chains? Any commentary on that? And yeah, like how and why that's being linked with some of these climate regulations?
Sustainability is increasingly being seen as much wider than just carbon or the environment, and that's because we see all of these things are linked. And a good example of that on the social side is modern day slavery, as you say. And in New Zealand, we're not quite there yet with the regulation, but what Europe is setting is proof in supply chains that there is no modern day slavery. And we're really seeing that across commodities like bananas, coffee, chocolate.
Okay, so New Zealand, broadly speaking, it sounds like the task ahead is we need to instrument our supply chains to get more data, more instantaneous visibility, and climate reporting standards set across small businesses and large businesses. That's how we'll continue to have competitiveness in the export markets, where the trends are going, what's already here. You had mentioned at the beginning, maybe we didn't deserve our clean green reputation as much as we're getting credit for it. Share more about what you feel there.
I think that New Zealand has this clean green image, just 100% pure, which was helped by this values-driven economy piece we saw in COVID. And we have a really strong brand on the world stage. But when you dig a little bit deeper, we're doing okay on some of this work, but we're falling far, far behind Europe and the UK. And we're actually falling further behind with every month. That's how quickly these regulations are coming out in those European and British markets. I see an opportunity to close that gap if we do start walking the talk, but we actually need to take action because as these regulations come into force globally, consumers are and retailers, they are understanding what true sustainability means, and greenwashing isn't holding up very well on the world stage in some markets anymore.
So you talked about the Brussels effect and the impact of EU really setting standards. I'm always curious, like how New Zealand can be a leader and help set a tone, even though we're a small country, of course. What are you seeing as either opportunities or examples there?
I think New Zealand has a huge opportunity to be a leader on the world stage. We already have this green platform. We just need to lean into it. And we've done that a huge number of times in New Zealand's history, like our nuclear-free movement. And one area that I've seen recently that hasn't had that much airtime is our agreement with the EU, the EU-New Zealand Free Trade Agreement. And in that agreement, interestingly, there's a chapter on sustainable farming, there's an article on gender equality, and there's also many references to meeting Paris Agreement commitments. And this is really quite unique for a free trade agreement. As far as I'm aware, it's those types of sustainability standards have never been included in a free trade agreement before. And if the parties to the agreement don't meet those standards, then the other party can trigger the sanctions, which is quite unique for an agreement like this. And it's also should be a little bit nerve-wracking for New Zealand because, as I'm sure your listeners know, the EU is on track. It is tracking well to meet Paris Agreement commitments, whereas New Zealand is not doing so well. And I had the opportunity to meet with Tobias Perlings recently. He's the director of the Ministry for Economics in Germany. And he was pointing out how unique this was and what an important part of their negotiation it was for the free trade agreement. And that they're actually trying to include similar standards with agreements happening at the moment with India and Australia. So I think it's really fantastic to see that New Zealand has been part of that global standard setting for free trade agreements.
Yeah. I remember when the Paris Agreement happened, and I remember reading and hearing like, well, it doesn't have full legal teeth for enforcement. It's still kind of voluntary pledges at some level. And and now we see it with like the voluntary carbon market is developing and going through highs and lows, but it's still like voluntary carbon market. And then you have years later examples where a trade agreement has sanctions based on commitments and targets from the Paris Agreement. So it's just an example of where the life cycle and maturity curve of a lot of these agreements are, maybe they start with a bit more voluntary mechanisms, things that aren't legally enforced fully, and then they move into having, very much foundational level consequences in our legal system. And I think it's just kind of a meta pattern that we can observe, because now we have things coming out of the Montreal 30 by 30, and obviously a lot of businesses and governments making fairly ambitious statements about what they're going to do for climate, and not necessarily seeing the actions fully behind it yet. But this is clearly where the puck is going.
Exactly.
Anything else I didn't ask, or any other closing thoughts you'd like to share?
I think there's a real opportunity for New Zealand to be a leader in sustainable business. We already have that platform. We have some regulation like climate-related disclosures, and we've got a small economy. We often have really short supply chains that we can understand, that we can get data from. And if we can lean into that and set the world standard, it'll have so many positive impacts for our economy and for our people and planet too.
Well, thank you so much, Florence, for taking the time. Really appreciate the work you're doing. We'll continue to watch with great interest.
Kia ora. Thanks so much, Matthew.
All right. I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Florence. To learn more about these topics, you might be interested in our conversation with Jerry Ward from EY about corporate sustainability in New Zealand, as well as Dean Spicer from ANZ Bank about sustainable finance. You can find links in the show notes and all of our conversations at maearth.com. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you next time.